By the beginning of 1945, the strategic fate of Nazi Germany was sealed. The question was no longer if the Allied forces would win, but when and at what final cost. The catastrophic failure of the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes had utterly depleted the last operational reserves of the German army on the Western Front, sacrificing irreplaceable manpower, tanks, and fuel for a political fantasy. The path toward the German heartland was now unequivocally open for the victorious Allied armies, but the final assault was immediately confronted by the last, massive natural barrier, the Rhine River. This immense waterway was more than just a geographic feature. It represented the final, crucial defensive line, carrying immense military and profound psychological significance for the German nation. The Allied objective was clear and unified: to penetrate the German frontier defenses, cross the Rhine, and achieve the final, decisive military victory to end the war swiftly. The Rhine was considered the final, unbreachable obstacle, a formidable body of water roughly 300 to 500 yards wide, flowing fast and deep, and secured along its entire length by the remaining determined German forces. The German command, desperate to delay the inevitable, issued rigid, frantic orders to destroy every single bridge spanning the river as the Allied forces approached, recognizing that preventing a river crossing was their last hope of establishing a prolonged defense. The Allied advance was dictated by the dire military situation facing the German forces on all sides. While the Western Allies were pressing toward the Rhine, the Soviet armies were simultaneously launching a massive, overwhelming offensive on the Eastern Front, the Vistula-Oder operation, driving relentlessly toward Berlin and the German industrial heartland. This immense Soviet pressure served a vital strategic function for the Western Allies. It ensured that Hitler could not possibly transfer any significant reserves from the east to defend the Rhine, effectively locking the German army into a fatal two-front squeeze with no possibility of reinforcement or recovery. The planning for the final crossing was meticulously complex. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, chose to pursue a broad front strategy, advancing along the entire German border rather than concentrating all resources on a single, narrow thrust. This approach was designed to prevent the Germans from concentrating their remaining forces to defend any one spot, ensuring that the Allied armies could exploit any weakness that might appear. The challenge was immense. The Allies needed to secure numerous crossing points simultaneously, relying on vast logistical planning, immense engineering resources, and a final, overwhelming display of air power to suppress German defenses. The ultimate strategic goal, agreed upon by the Allied leadership, was not necessarily the immediate capture of Berlin, which was left to the Soviet sphere, but the swift destruction of the remaining German armies and the seizure of the German industrial region of the Ruhr, which was essential to crippling the last vestiges of German war production. The stage was set for the final, brutal confrontation that would lead to the physical collapse of the Third Reich. The immense, unyielding Rhine River stood as the final, absolute barrier to the Allied advance, and the last remaining natural obstacle protecting the industrial heartland of Germany. The German High Command, though its armies were severely depleted by the catastrophic losses in the Ardennes, was ordered to hold the Rhine line at all costs, recognizing that if the Allies secured a major bridgehead, the entire Western Front would collapse. The German military committed its remaining engineering units to the systematic, comprehensive destruction of every bridge along the river, successfully demolishing scores of vital crossing points in a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. The Allied armies, after months of continuous fighting, prepared for the monumental task of forcing a crossing, an operation that required immense logistical coordination and a final display of overwhelming military force. The Allied forces secured their first, crucial, and completely unexpected breakthrough on March 7, 1945. As American troops advanced into the town of Remagen, they discovered the vital Ludendorff Bridge, a massive railway bridge, still miraculously standing. The German demolition teams, either due to poor training, inadequate explosives, or command confusion, had failed to completely destroy the structure. American forces immediately recognized the immense significance of this intact crossing point, rushing across the structure under heavy German fire before the enemy could make a second, decisive attempt to destroy it. The capture of the Remagen Bridge was an enormous stroke of luck and a critical strategic victory. It allowed the American First Army to immediately establish a secure, deep bridgehead on the eastern side of the Rhine, fundamentally altering the entire Allied timetable and strategy. It was a premature rupture in the German line that forced the German command to divert scarce resources to contain the threat. However, the main, planned crossings were still necessary to launch the broad front offensive. The most massive and meticulously planned operation was conducted further north, under the command of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. This operation, codenamed Operation Plunder, was designed to be an overwhelming display of concentrated power, ensuring the crossing would succeed with minimal loss of life. Plunder involved a colossal crossing effort utilizing thousands of amphibious vehicles, ferries, and engineer units that rapidly constructed pontoon bridges and laid assault crossings. The crossing was preceded by an immense aerial bombardment designed to suppress all remaining German anti-aircraft and artillery positions along the eastern bank. Crucially integrated into Operation Plunder was Operation Varsity, the final major air landing operation of the European War. This operation, launched on March 24, 1945, involved the simultaneous dropping of the American 17th Airborne Division and the British 6th Airborne Division onto the eastern bank of the Rhine, just as the ground troops were making their crossing. The goal was to secure the critical high ground immediately beyond the river, eliminate any organized German resistance that could interfere with the ground forces, and ensure that the vital bridgehead remained secure. The operation was launched in daylight, relying on overwhelming Allied air supremacy for protection. While the airborne troops faced fierce, determined resistance from the remaining German forces, including desperate infantry and the local Home Guard units, the paratroopers succeeded in their mission, quickly establishing a strong, crucial foothold on the far bank. The sheer size, coordination, and overwhelming force of the crossings utterly shattered the German will to resist the final, decisive Allied advance into the heart of Germany. The successful, swift Allied crossings of the Rhine River, spearheaded by the miraculous capture of the Remagen Bridge and the massive coordinated thrust of Operation Plunder/Varsity, shattered the final, organized defensive line of the Third Reich in the west. With the Rhine barrier breached, the strategically vital Ruhr region, the industrial heartland of Germany, lay immediately vulnerable. The Ruhr was the engine that still sustained the German war effort, home to immense coal mines, steel mills, and critical manufacturing centers. Its neutralization was paramount to crippling the last vestiges of German military production and securing a swift end to the war. The Allied command, under General Dwight D. Eisenhower, immediately launched a colossal pincer maneuver designed not merely to seize the Ruhr, but to totally encircle and destroy the remaining German forces defending the region. The American strategy was to conduct a massive, rapid-fire exploitation of the bridgeheads already established across the Rhine. The forces of the 9th U.S. Army, advancing swiftly from the north across the northern Rhine plain, and the 1st U.S. Army, driving hard from the south across the Remagen bridgehead, began a coordinated and relentless convergence far inland. The primary goal was to bypass the heavily fortified urban areas and link up east of the Ruhr, trapping the German forces within a massive, inescapable pocket. Trapped within this rapidly forming, colossal circle was German Army Group B, commanded by the aging and respected Field Marshal Walter Model. This formation represented the largest remaining cohesive concentration of German military power on the entire Western Front, comprising approximately 325,000 men, including several seasoned infantry divisions, and the remnants of various armored units. Model, under direct and desperate orders from Hitler to stand and fight to the last man, initially attempted to organize a rigid, fanatical defense. However, the overwhelming speed and numerical superiority of the American pincers, combined with the continuous, punishing dominance of Allied air power, which attacked every movement and road, rendered any coordinated defense completely impossible. The German forces were increasingly fragmented, suffering from severe shortages of food, ammunition, and, most critically, fuel. The Allied encirclement was completed on April 1, 1945, when the 9th and 1st U.S. Armies linked up near the town of Lippstadt, sealing the fate of Army Group B. The battle then devolved into a gruesome, desperate mopping-up operation within the Ruhr Pocket. The fighting became increasingly chaotic, with the encircled German forces fragmenting into localized resistance pockets. Many of the younger, fanatical soldiers, particularly those from the Waffen-SS and Hitler Youth units, fought with suicidal determination, resulting in severe losses for both sides. However, the vast majority of the German troops, exhausted, demoralized, and recognizing the utter hopelessness of their position, began to surrender in massive numbers. The destruction of the Ruhr Pocket marked the definitive end of organized German resistance in the West. By mid-April, Field Marshal Model, recognizing the futility of his situation and refusing to surrender to the Allies, committed suicide in a forest south of Duisburg. The battle concluded on April 18, 1945, with the surrender of the remaining German troops. The Allied forces captured over 325,000 prisoners, a massive, irreplaceable loss that shattered the last ability of the German command to maintain any semblance of a continuous front line. With the industrial heartland secured and the last field army destroyed, the Western Allies were free to begin the final, strategic race eastward toward the final, designated demarcation lines, and their eventual meeting with the Soviet forces. The massive, final collapse of German Army Group B in the Ruhr Pocket in mid-April 1945 irrevocably shattered the last organized German military resistance on the Western Front. With the industrial heartland secured and the main defensive army eliminated, the entire Allied campaign transitioned from a tactical battle of attrition to an immense strategic pursuit. The remaining German defenses were fragmented, consisting mainly of desperate, isolated pockets of resistance, disorganized young soldiers of the Hitler Youth, and older men from the Home Guard units, who lacked the equipment, training, and political will to effectively halt the relentless Allied advance. The Western Allies now launched a massive, final race eastward, driven by three key strategic priorities. The first priority was to eliminate all remaining organized German opposition and secure their designated zones of occupation as quickly as possible. The primary decision was made by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who opted decisively against a direct, costly race for the German capital, Berlin. This decision, made in coordination with the established agreements between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, recognized that Berlin lay well within the designated Soviet sphere of influence and that capturing the city would entail immense casualties and unnecessary geopolitical complications with the Soviet command. Instead, the Allied forces focused on a broad sweep, neutralizing the remaining enemy forces and ensuring the rapid collapse of the fragmented front. The second, related priority was the prevention of a potential final, fanatical German stand in the south. Allied intelligence feared that the remaining SS units and hardline Nazi leadership would retreat to the mountainous areas of southern Germany and Austria, creating a fortified lair known as the National Redoubt. While this redoubt ultimately proved to be a politically driven fantasy rather than a genuine military threat, the Allied forces committed significant resources to clearing southern Germany, capturing vast territories including Bavaria, to prevent any prolonged, isolated resistance that could delay the war's final conclusion. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Soviet armies were moving with devastating speed. Following the immense successes of their winter offensives, the Soviets were rapidly approaching the Oder River and were poised for the final assault on Berlin. The strategic goal of both Allied forces was now to meet along a previously agreed-upon line of demarcation deep within Germany, effectively dividing the conquered territory into zones of control. The relentless, aggressive speed of the Western Allied advance, covering hundreds of miles in mere weeks, was a direct reflection of the almost total disintegration of the German ability to mount any cohesive defense. The historic culmination of this race across Germany occurred on April 25, 1945. American soldiers from the 1st U.S. Army and Soviet soldiers from the 1st Ukrainian Front met decisively on the banks of the Elbe River near the town of Torgau. This single, symbolic handshake between the American Lieutenant Bill Robertson and the Soviet Lieutenant Alexander Silvashko confirmed the total, physical conquest of the Third Reich, geographically signifying the link-up of the two immense fronts and the complete encirclement of the remaining German heartland. The moment was one of immense global celebration, marking the tangible end of the long, costly military struggle in Europe. With the two fronts connected, the final fate of Germany, and the formal end of the war, lay only days away. While the Western Allies were concluding their strategic race eastward and securing their designated zones of occupation, the final, most brutal, and largest military operation of the entire European war was unfolding in the east, the decisive battle for Berlin. The Soviet leadership, driven by a fierce desire for political prestige, vengeance, and the need to secure the capital of the Third Reich, committed immense resources to capturing the city swiftly and unequivocally. The entire operation was dictated by both political necessity and military pride, ensuring that the Soviet Union would bear the responsibility and the glory of delivering the final fatal blow to the enemy state. The massive offensive was spearheaded by the three largest Soviet formations: the First Belarusian Front, commanded by Marshal Georgy Zhukov; the First Ukrainian Front, commanded by Marshal Ivan Konyev; and the Second Belarusian Front. The total Soviet forces committed to the final push toward Berlin and the subsequent street fighting numbered over 2.5 million soldiers, supported by over 6,250 tanks and an unprecedented 41,000 pieces of artillery. This sheer, overwhelming concentration of manpower and firepower made the assault an unstoppable force. The operation commenced in mid-April 1945, with the Red Army launching a massive, coordinated offensive designed to quickly smash the remaining German forces defending the approaches to the capital, particularly along the Oder and Neisse rivers. The German defense of Berlin was characterized by utter desperation and fragmentation. The once formidable German army was reduced to a chaotic, disorganized mix of severely depleted regular army units, fanatical Waffen-SS units, hastily armed boys of the Hitler Youth, and older men from the civilian Home Guard units. Command of the city's defense was often confused, with Hitler issuing delusional orders from his underground bunker, the Führerbunker, demanding counterattacks with phantom armies that no longer existed. Despite the hopelessness of their cause, many of the defenders, particularly the SS and Hitler Youth elements, fought with fanatical, suicidal ferocity, turning the approach to Berlin into a killing field. The first major obstacle for the Soviet forces was the Seelow Heights, a formidable defensive ridge that guarded the main approach to the capital. Marshal Zhukov's forces launched a brutal, costly frontal assault against this heavily fortified position. The fighting was prolonged and intense, resulting in massive casualties for the Soviet forces, but the overwhelming numbers and continuous pressure eventually broke the German defensive line, opening the path for the final drive into the city. As the Soviet forces pushed into the suburbs, the defense transitioned into the ultimate phase of house-to-house, street-by-street urban combat. The ensuing battle for the city of Berlin itself was a brutal, agonizing siege. The city was a vast, sprawling labyrinth of rubble and fortified buildings, providing perfect defensive positions for the German defenders. Soviet infantry and tanks fought inch by agonizing inch, utilizing concentrated artillery fire and specialized urban assault tactics to clear buildings and eliminate resistance nests. The heavy use of artillery, often fired directly into buildings at point-blank range, reduced the city center to a lunar landscape of shattered buildings and debris. The final phase of the battle centered on the massive government buildings, culminating in the fierce struggle for the Reichstag, the German parliament building, which became the ultimate symbolic objective for the advancing Soviet soldiers. The fall of the Reichstag signaled the imminent collapse of the capital and the entire Nazi regime. As the colossal Soviet offensive raged above the streets of Berlin, tearing down the last defenses and reducing the capital to rubble, the final scenes of the Third Reich's political collapse were unfolding deep beneath the ground in a concrete, subterranean structure known simply as the leader's underground shelter. This cramped, airless bunker became the chilling stage for the ultimate, psychological breakdown of the Nazi regime, insulating its leader, Adolf Hitler, from the overwhelming reality of the defeat surrounding him. Hitler had retreated permanently into the bunker in January 1945, and his physical and mental state deteriorated rapidly in the final months. He was often afflicted by severe shaking, possibly due to Parkinson's disease, and was sustained by a complex cocktail of drugs administered by his personal physician. Surrounded by a dwindling, desperate circle of loyalists, Hitler lived in a world of profound delusion and denial. He continued to issue aggressive, impossible military orders, demanding counterattacks by German armies that had long since been annihilated or captured by the relentless Allied advance. The most famous of these fantasies was his reliance on General Wenck's 12th Army, which he ordered to turn back from the west to relieve the besieged capital, an operation that existed purely in Hitler's imagination and could not possibly be executed by the fractured German forces. The atmosphere within the underground shelter was one of escalating paranoia, tension, and absolute doom. News of the Soviet approach was heavily filtered and often concealed, yet the shaking of the ground from the continuous Soviet artillery bombardment was a constant, inescapable reminder of the enemy's proximity. Hitler held his final military conferences in this claustrophobic environment, unleashing terrifying rages upon his generals, whom he blamed entirely for the defeat, accusing them of treachery and failure. This descent into fury often masked his own desperate fear and strategic paralysis. The final act of political collapse began with the sudden, shocking betrayals of his most senior deputies. In the final week of April, Hitler discovered that Heinrich Himmler, the powerful head of the German security forces, had secretly attempted to open negotiations for a surrender in the West via Swedish contact. Shortly thereafter, he learned that Hermann Göring, the once powerful head of the German Air Force, had attempted to seize overall political leadership, citing a previously established decree. These acts of disloyalty, viewed by Hitler as the ultimate treason, fueled his final, absolute fury. He immediately ordered the arrest of both men, effectively severing the last lines of communication between the bunker and the remaining German forces. Recognizing that the Soviet forces were now fighting directly above his shelter, and that the time for escape or maneuver had irrevocably run out, Hitler performed his final, strange acts of personal duty. He married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, in a short, civil ceremony in the bunker in the early hours of April 29. Following this, he dictated his final political testament, expelling the traitors Göring and Himmler from the party, and appointing Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor and new head of state. On the afternoon of April 30, 1945, with the Soviet forces mere yards away, Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide in their private quarters. Their bodies were hastily carried outside by remaining bunker staff, doused with gasoline, and burned in a shallow crater, as per Hitler's explicit, paranoid instructions to prevent his corpse from being captured or publicly displayed by the enemy. The ultimate, absolute command structure of the Third Reich had collapsed, signaling the irreversible end of the Nazi regime and the immediate conclusion of the war in Europe. As the Allied armies, both the Western forces and the relentless Soviet Red Army, advanced deeper into the collapsing territories of the Third Reich, the military campaign transitioned into a moral and humanitarian reckoning. The final phase of the war revealed to the world the unspeakable, industrial-scale horrors that lay concealed within the network of Nazi concentration and extermination camps, providing the first undeniable evidence of the Holocaust, the state-sponsored, systematic persecution and murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. For the frontline soldiers, who had been fighting a conventional military war for years, the sheer scale of the atrocity they uncovered was a profound, immediate, and lasting psychological shock that transcended the brutality of the battlefield. The liberation process was carried out sequentially, starting in the East. The Soviet Red Army was the first to encounter the absolute depths of Nazi depravity. In July 1944, Soviet forces liberated the Majdanek camp in Poland, providing the first glimpse of the industrial killing centers. The most famous and chilling discovery came in January 1945, when the Soviets overran Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest extermination and concentration complex. What the Soviet troops found were massive, complex structures designed for mass murder, including vast gas chambers, crematoria, and immense warehouses filled with the clothing, human hair, and personal belongings of millions of victims. The few thousand prisoners found alive were skeletal, starving, and often too weak to stand, bearing silent witness to the systematic savagery that had defined the regime. On the Western Front, the American and British forces began their own gruesome process of discovery as they swept across Germany in the spring of 1945. They liberated major camps such as Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. The scenes uncovered by the advancing Western troops were no less horrifying. At Bergen-Belsen, British troops found tens of thousands of unburied corpses lying in mass graves and the compound, victims of starvation and typhus. At Buchenwald and Dachau, American soldiers discovered the skeletal survivors, the physical evidence of medical experiments, and the constant, overwhelming smell of death and disease. The soldiers, horrified by the inhumanity, were often compelled to force the local German civilian populations to visit the camps and bear direct witness to the atrocities committed in their name and on their own soil, attempting to shatter the pervasive culture of denial and complicity. The historical significance of these liberations was immediate and monumental. The photographic and film evidence gathered by Allied war correspondents and intelligence officers provided irrefutable proof of the deliberate, massive-scale nature of the Nazi genocide. This evidence transformed the understanding of the war, making it clear that the conflict was not just a geopolitical struggle, but a defense against a regime of absolute evil. The shocking reality of the Holocaust immediately laid the foundation for the subsequent war crimes trials at Nuremberg, shifting the focus from military victory to the need for accountability and the establishment of international justice for crimes against humanity. The discovery of the camps ensured that the memory of the victims, and the moral imperative to prevent such systemic brutality from ever recurring, would become a permanent, agonizing legacy of the Second World War. Following the confirmation of Adolf Hitler's suicide in his underground shelter on April 30, 1945, the remaining structure of the Third Reich instantly fractured. The final authority was theoretically transferred to Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, whom Hitler had designated as his successor and the new head of state. The immediate objective of the new, temporary German government under Dönitz was no longer to fight for victory, but desperately to end the war, while simultaneously saving as many German soldiers and civilians as possible from capture by the relentless Soviet armies on the Eastern Front. This led to a period of intense, disorganized, and highly political surrender attempts across the collapsing front lines. The German High Command's primary strategy was to negotiate quick, localized surrenders to the Western Allies, the American and British forces, while continuing to fight fiercely against the Soviet forces in the East. This strategy was designed to allow vast numbers of German soldiers, who feared Soviet reprisals, to flow westward and surrender safely into the American and British zones of control. This desperate, mass movement of soldiers and refugees westward created immense chaos along the remaining roads, but significantly accelerated the collapse of the German military resistance against the Western Allies. German delegations were sent out across Europe, signing localized surrender agreements to stop the fighting in specific regions like Italy, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia, demonstrating a desire to end the struggle quickly with the Western powers. The immense pressure from the advancing Soviet forces and the utter collapse of the German command structure led to the moment of final, formal military capitulation. On May 7, 1945, the designated representative of the German High Command, General Alfred Jodl, formally signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender to the Western Allies and the Soviet Union at the Allied headquarters in Reims, France. This first signing legally ended all fighting, effective at 23:01 Central European Time on May 8. The rapid timing of this surrender was largely dictated by the Western Allies, who were eager to conclude the conflict. However, Joseph Stalin and the Soviet High Command were furious. Stalin viewed the signing at Reims as insufficient. He insisted that the act of total military defeat must be formally repeated and signed in the capital of the defeated nation, Berlin, by the highest-ranking representative of the German military, recognizing the immense Soviet sacrifices that had largely destroyed the German army. Consequently, a second, final signing ceremony was held late the following night. On the late evening of May 8, 1945, which, due to the time difference, became May 9 in Moscow, the final, definitive unconditional surrender was signed in a shattered building in Berlin. The document was signed by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel on behalf of the German High Command. This final signing officially brought the war in Europe to a close. News of the final surrender immediately sparked massive, spontaneous celebrations across the entire Allied world. The official declaration of victory in Europe Day, V-Day, was made on May 8, 1945. Massive crowds gathered in capitals across the world, from London and New York to Moscow, celebrating the hard-won end of 6 years of continuous warfare. While the political and military struggle against Japan in the Pacific still remained, the elimination of Nazi Germany marked the decisive conclusion of the European conflict, confirming the ultimate triumph of the Allied coalition and ushering in the complex, new era of the post-war world. With the final declaration of victory in Europe Day in May 1945, the vast, devastating military struggle that had consumed the continent for 6 years came to an end. However, the conclusion of the armed conflict immediately initiated a new, equally profound confrontation, the transition from the battlefield to the courtroom, aimed at establishing moral, political, and judicial accountability for the unprecedented scale of the atrocities committed by the collapsing Nazi regime. The Allies were determined that this war would not conclude with simple military defeat, but with a full, public legal reckoning that would permanently establish the principle that national leaders and state officials could be held personally responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The foundation for this judicial process was established in August 1945 with the London Agreement, signed by the major Allied powers, the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France. This agreement formally created the International Military Tribunal, and laid out the framework for prosecuting the principal surviving leaders of the Third Reich. The Allies defined three core categories of offenses that transcended traditional battlefield laws: crimes against peace, planning and waging an aggressive war, war crimes, violations of the laws of war, including mistreatment of prisoners and occupied populations, and, most importantly, crimes against humanity, murder, extermination, enslavement, and persecution on political, racial, or religious grounds, specifically relating to the Holocaust. This last category established a crucial, lasting precedent in international law. The city chosen to host this historic trial was Nuremberg, a highly symbolic selection. While much of the city lay in ruins, it was historically significant as the site of the massive Nazi Party rallies and the birthplace of the infamous anti-Jewish laws. By holding the trials in Nuremberg, the Allies consciously chose to stage the legal dismantling of the regime in the very place where its ideology had been publicly celebrated. The trials, which began in November 1945, placed 24 of the most powerful surviving Nazi leaders and heads of organizations in the defendant's dock, including figures like Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. The trial was characterized by profound historical tension, as the leaders of the defeated state were brought to face justice before a court composed of their victorious enemies. The trials were fundamentally a confrontation with the irrefutable evidence of systematic evil. The prosecution relied heavily on a staggering volume of captured German documents, meticulous Nazi records, detailed film footage collected by Allied soldiers during the liberation of the concentration camps, and the painful, harrowing testimony of concentration camp survivors. This evidence demonstrated conclusively that the atrocities were not the random acts of rogue units, but were the result of deliberate, meticulous, state-level policy and planning. The trial established the systemic nature of the Holocaust and proved the culpability of the highest leadership. The immense public record created by the International Military Tribunal guaranteed that the world could never deny the scale and nature of the crimes committed by the Nazi state. The ultimate judgment, delivered in late 1946, convicted many of the high-ranking defendants, ensuring that the legacy of World War II would be defined not just by the military victory of the Allies, but by the moral and legal necessity of international justice. The trials definitively ended the war in Europe on a moral, judicial note, setting a new standard for accountability in the modern era. The Declaration of Victory in Europe Day in May 1945 did not usher in a period of immediate, lasting peace, but rather a profound, fundamental transformation of global politics and military strategy. The successful conclusion of the final assault on Germany marked the end of the devastating conflict against Nazism, but it simultaneously revealed the immense, irreconcilable ideological and geopolitical rift between the former Allies, the Soviet Union and the Western powers, the United States and Great Britain. The war against Hitler had been won, but the foundations for the next global conflict, the Cold War, were immediately and irrevocably established in the rubble of the defeated Reich. The first and most critical legacy of the final assault was the physical division of Germany and Europe. The successful link-up of American and Soviet forces on the Elbe River, while a moment of profound celebration, merely formalized the pre-agreed zones of occupation. The massive concentration of Soviet troops in Eastern Europe, combined with Stalin's political maneuvering, ensured that Eastern Europe fell firmly under Soviet political and military domination. Germany itself was divided into 4 zones: American, British, French, and Soviet, with the capital, Berlin, similarly partitioned deep within the Soviet zone. The subsequent failure of the Western and Soviet powers to agree on a unified future for Germany led directly to the creation of 2 separate German states, West Germany and East Germany, a physical manifestation of the emerging Iron Curtain that would divide the continent ideologically and militarily for the next 5 decades. The military cost of the final assault and the victory was staggering. The sheer scale of destruction across the German industrial heartland and, most visibly, within the city of Berlin, was immense and unprecedented. The victory confirmed the ultimate strategic triumph of Allied industrial and logistical power, demonstrating that the sheer weight of American and Soviet production had overwhelmed the technologically superior but resource-starved German war machine. The final capture of the territory also led to the critical realization of the massive transfer of scientific and technical expertise, particularly regarding German rocketry and nuclear programs, into the hands of both the American and Soviet militaries, accelerating the post-war arms race. Finally, the end of the war confirmed a massive global power shift. The old European colonial empires, France, Great Britain, and the Netherlands, were severely weakened, their treasuries drained, and their global dominance irrevocably shattered by the immense effort of the war. In their place emerged two colossal, rival superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. These two nations, possessing vastly different political ideologies and fundamentally incompatible visions for the future of the conquered territories, immediately entered into a protracted period of geopolitical tension, military rivalry, and proxy conflict. The immediate political friction over Eastern European control, the fate of atomic weapons, and the continued division of Germany ensured that the peace won in 1945 was cold and deeply unstable. The legal and moral reckoning of the Nuremberg trials established a new precedent for international justice, yet the political struggle for control over the post-war world began the very moment the final guns fell silent. The European conflict had ended, but the global struggle for dominance had only just begun.